Hi, good afternoon all. It's 3 o'clock here in the UK. We've got more of you joining from overseas, so please let us know where you are in the world as well. It's great to hear from you all. This afternoon is a really special presentation now from Bohemia Interactive Simulations. They're our tech sponsor, and as such, they've enabled us to be able to put this all on Hopin for everybody, so we're really grateful to them. And their continuing support is really important to the DSET community as well. So we've got Rusmat Ahmed for you, Bill Starmer and Earl Laamanen, who are going to come on board and do a fireside chat, and they're going to tell you all about it. So I have now got Rusmat with me. Hi, Rusmat. Hi, Rusmat, can you hear me? He's got the gear.
Hi, Tess. I think the earphones aren't working. I think you're coming up on the. Let me try and put.
Okay. Do you want to reset that? Are we waiting for Earl and Bill as well? Okay, cool. Right, you're on mute at the moment, Rusmat. So, right, Earl is just arriving. So that's all good. So we're going to bring Earl in as well. The microphone's working fine, Rusmat. So we're just doing that. So we're just waiting for Earl to be brought in. Just a second to load. Here he is. Hi, Earl.
Hi, guys.
Can you hear us okay? And Bill's just arrived as well. So we'll just be bringing Bill in as well. So just a reminder, if you would like to put any questions to the Bohemia team, please drop them in the chat here or in the Q&A tab, and they can access those as well, but then I'll be around at the end of all of this to bring them up. So Rusmat, thank you very much for joining us today. Rusmat, where are you in the world?
I'm in Bristol.
You're in Bristol, okay.
Yeah, I apologise for the noise, but these aren't working. We'll carry on. I will mute and we'll crack on.
No, that's fine. And Bill, where are you at the moment?
I'm in California, so near San Jose.
Cool. Well, thanks for getting up early.
Yep, glad to do it.
And Earl, where are you?
I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Cool. So there we go. There's an international billing for you. Right. I'm going to disappear out of this now, and then I'll just leave you to get on with it. So thank you so very much for joining us, and it's over to you guys.
Great. Thank you very much to a fireside chat called Talking Terrains, brought to you live from a coffee shop in Bristol, which is my native home. Not Bristol, but coffee shops. Earl in Pittsburgh and Bill in San Jose. So the reason we thought we'd talk about terrains is last year we talked about metaverse, and terrains are intimately involved in all of that. And there's a lot new in terrains, and there's a lot that is still unknown, I think, quite mysterious for terrains. So I'm going to just ask Bill and Earl a very simple question to start with, and we'll try and build up the complexity. So Bill and Earl, I don't think this will throw you. How did you get into terrain databases in the first place? Earl, how did you do it?
So actually at the, I think it was the release of VBS2, which is going back to around 2007 or so, we needed to have content production tools with the release. So I think VBS1 didn't really have much in the way of content creation for customers. And so we were taking tools that were made for the game industry from Operation Flashpoint and in the early days of Arma there, and documenting them and making them available to VBS2 customers. So I was tasked with coming over from the 3D modeling side of things, understanding how the terrain tools work. And of course, these were internal tools developed by Czech people for Czech people. So a lot of the documentation that did exist was in a different language. And so we had to work it out, document it for VBS customers. And that was the origin of me starting to work on simulation terrain. Oh, you're still muted.
Matt, you're muted.
What was your area of speciality before that? Because this technical stuff wasn't what you started in your studies with.
If you mean just with Bohemia, it was in 3D modeling and 3D content. In fact, I was recruited from the modding circuit on Operation Flashpoint, which is where I got my start with Bohemia.
Didn't you have something to do with agriculture, forestry, which kind of plays a role in terrains later on?
Oh, right. Yeah. So education-wise, yeah, I actually studied forestry when I was living on the west coast of Canada, and thought I would have a vibrant career in renewable resources, and modding games turned out to be more fun.
And Bill, what did you study? How did you get into terrains?
Yeah, so I took probably the more traditional route to a geospatial career. So I went to school for geography and studied GIS and remote sensing. And yeah, when I was finishing up my my studies, my wife ended up getting into the University of Pittsburgh. So we moved to Pittsburgh, and I needed to find a job. And luckily at the time, TerraSim was just starting, and they needed a GIS analyst, and I was available. So I took that gig, and much to my surprise, many years later, I'm still doing this. I actually thought I was going to have a career sort of doing remote sensing, land cover mapping. That's sort of what I studied. And so I had no idea that 3D anything really was a thing until I heard about TerraSim. And like Earl, it's like Earl said, 3D anything is far more interesting than some of the more traditional stuff. And it's been motivating and pretty interesting ride so far.
Good. Bill, what for you makes terrain interesting?
Sorry, Birgit, what makes terrain what?
Interesting. What's an interesting terrain for you?
I think to me, I've seen sort of terrain evolve over the years, and it's always been about sort of pushing what we can do in terms of the representation of the Earth, driving forward sort of what simulation and training systems can do with terrain. And early days, it was sort of the visuals were not quite as good, but there was a lot of focus on constructive simulation, and also some of the work that we were doing early, sort of focusing on some pretty basic visuals, but still kind of very important work for training simulators. And to me, it's always been that, trying to find, like, anytime you do a terrain project, trying to see what can you advance, how can we automate something and leverage the GIS data? How can we improve the visual quality? How can we make the simulations better? And just sort of those little tweaks and continuous adaptation is what I find interesting.
It sounds like you don't like doing the same type of thing twice. You always like it to be different and new. Is that right?
Yeah, and that is one of the interesting things about doing terrain generation, is that you're generally bouncing to different areas, unless we're modeling SPTA, which we seem to model that every couple of years. But as we look at different environments, and even there, we're always looking at doing something different. How can we augment it, make it better in the future?
And Earl, what for you makes the terrain interesting to work
on? I would actually say some of the more interesting projects I've worked on is when there isn't enough information to go on. Sometimes the source data that you're working with is limited, and you have to make some interesting decisions to get a useful and accurate terrain built based on kind of minimal sources. And sometimes that pushes you to find some interesting techniques to do things in a new way that hadn't been done before, or just gathering all the different tools available and just trying to find a way to represent something that is functional for training, that kind of bridges the gap and gets over some of the limitations that you might have with the source data that you're working with.
Can you talk about different source data? Because people talk very generically about that, but what does that mean? What are the differences between them? What are the differences between different levels of height, accuracy, and elevation? Can you untangle that and take the mystery out of 5 centimeters, 90 centimeters, or whatever as well?
Yeah, so I guess at a really high level, there's sort of three main categories. There's obviously the commercial data sources, Maxars, Airbus, those sort of satellite providers, people that actually fly satellites and collect imagery. There's a lot of national data sets that are being put together, especially a lot of European nations have open sourced their collections, so they'll fly aerial photography or something and LiDAR scans and convert it into really useful starting data for us, and then they make that available with an open license on the internet. New Zealand comes to mind, having an extremely high quality national data set for the whole country. Not a particularly large country to do that in, but still interesting nonetheless that they make it all available for free. And then there's some of the sort of crowdsourced and open source websites, OpenStreetMaps being probably the most well-known, where it's sort of crowdsourced. People are adding in data. I don't know how many different contributors there are, but it's a high number of people adding in data. And of course, you have to be worried about quality when it's crowdsourced, but it's a pretty amazing collection of data that's just available there for free. And I think the commercial providers are definitely, it's becoming much more accessible than it was in the past. So I think I just saw the news recently that Maxar released their 30 centimeter mosaic of the globe. And I think that's the first time I've noticed in a press release from a satellite provider that they actually mentioned virtual simulation. Usually we're not the primary use case that they're thinking of. They have a lot of different customers doing geointelligence and other things, and virtual simulation is usually further down the list. But I think the U.S. Army has been changing people's minds with their One World Terrain effort. So yeah, hopefully that covers things.
Yeah. Now, you talked about you enjoy when data's missing. What do you do when data's missing or data's not very good? And I remember one story, I think, to do with the American Embassy.
Oh yeah, that was actually the Australian embassy in Baghdad. So this is, I think, around 2009 or so. There had been a VB IED, so a car bomb went off outside of the embassy. They had photos of the embassy in the newspapers, and our clients in the Australian Army wanted to put that into VBS2, but we didn't have at that time. We just didn't have a relationship for dealing with that sort of secret data. So they asked if we could just do our best and kind of represent it so they could mock up a vignette based on that. And there happened to be a photo online that probably shouldn't have been there on a site called Photo Bucket by an American soldier who was standing on the rooftop with some Australian friends and said, "Here's me with my Australian buddies." I was able to find that photo, and in the background were a few key landmarks that I could use to triangulate back to where that actually was located in Baghdad. So we were able to build the model, understand well enough where the location was, and situate the building. So those kinds of problems can be fun. In some ways, the new accessibility to the new commercial data sort of takes the fun out of it a little bit. All the data is there for you. So that's where we really get into, I guess, automation and just being able to have large scale terrain production these days. We're a little bit moving away from the sort of hands-on detailed work and going into automation.
Bill, not all kinds of data are created equal. They've got their strengths and weaknesses and so on, and don't show the same amount of fidelity that perhaps a user of virtual simulation expects. How do you in TerraSim get around that? You could talk about some procedural generation techniques.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've always focused on with our software is really to kind of maximize automation wherever possible. So really leveraging what you can squeeze out of the geospatial source. And as Earl mentioned, the quality of data has improved over the years, but even now we still do look to procedural techniques, either inside of the rendering engines that we're interfacing with, or in our terrain generation tools. And so you can play some games, especially in the training environment, where you don't necessarily need geospecific, very like realistic to the globe sorts of representations of the Earth. You can start to do procedural processing. So whether you're taking, building footprints from OpenStreetMap or Google or Microsoft or some of these other freely available source data, and through a set of basically putting together little scripting rules, you can then do extrusions that'll give you a better representation of what a particular area might look like. So we leverage that whenever possible, but then we'll also mix and match. So if you have some really high quality data, you're able to sort of use that as much as you can. And a lot of times we populate kind of the broader terrain area with these sort of procedural rendering techniques.
That sounds like it needs a huge amount of computing power. I guess you don't have a supercomputer under your desk. How much computing power does it actually take?
Well, yeah, actually the current generation of gaming computers are pretty capable. A typical workstation, that's what we're using on a daily basis. So our analysts that are building terrain and doing testing, It's a common, normal Windows PC with an NVIDIA graphics card is our general kit.
Bill, you touched upon some of it. You and Earl talked about different and better sources. But what are the main changes in the last, let's say, 5 years on building terrains? Is it just the data sources, or what else is it? Is it better hardware? What is it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a combination of better hardware. So every time that each generation comes out, it's always pretty amazing to see just how much more quickly we can generate terrain, how cheaper it is to get storage on your devices. Obviously, so the hardware cost benefits definitely improved. The rendering capabilities of different engines, both from our own internal, or the VBS Blue rendering engine and other game engines and simulation systems we interact with. The quality of source data too, both especially like Earl mentioned, on the commercial side, sort of the continuing evolution of increased resolution on the satellite imagery, different sensor sources. We're seeing more drone collection data. Some of the 3D procedural products that we see from companies like LuxCarta or Black Shark. It's just the quality and number of available data sources continues to increase. The crowdsourcing, so the OpenStreetMap is an incredible resource that we leverage on a daily basis. It's really made our lives a lot easier in terms of building better representations of the environment with data that is continuing to evolve. In fact, the volume of OpenStreetMap data, they have a growth chart, and you look at how much data is being collected on an annual basis, and it's amazing. There are a lot of sources out there, and that's something that I expect that trend's just going to continue, both from the open source, commercial sources as well.
Our customers, nonetheless, despite all those advances, they still have a lot of challenges, a lot of decisions to make. What are the main kind of challenges and decisions customers of ours or similar companies to TerraSims have to make?
I think one of the real key challenges I think that comes up often for a military customer at an enterprise level is having multiple simulations at the same time, right? Different terrain engines, different simulation systems that require terrain in different formats. And so correlation of the terrain is a really hard problem. And that's partly not just because translating the data into each different format is a technical challenge in and of itself. But you also have to make decisions regarding how good the correlation should be. And that always comes with trade-offs in terms of performance. So sometimes if you need exact correlation across every system, then you're stuck with the lowest common denominator. If a certain system can only draw so many trees per hectare, then we can't use everything that we can do in VBS4. We have to kind of simplify it, and you end up with a simple looking terrain in each of the different systems so that it's correlated. And so there's a lot of discussion around that to be able to put together a fully functional system that has the right terrain for each system. There is no single right answer when it comes to correlation.
Thanks. I'd like to ask a question about the link between game engines and terrains, or terrains and game engines, because a terrain with all the sources, the same sources, doesn't look the same in every game engine. So Bill, what's the link between terrains and game engines?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the key, as Earl kind of pointed out, it's sort of that common denominator. So a lot of times when we're generating terrain and we're sort of building it, understanding that there are going to be different formats or engines that we're exporting to, a lot of times you do make kind of engineering level decisions about how you're going to represent the terrain, the sorts of features you can model. So for example, if one system has a system for generating procedural vegetation based on a surface map, like a raster image of the surface, but then another one has a requirement for individual tree placements, and that's its only way to represent that, then we'll sometimes have to make a trade-off where we kind of understand what that limitation is and either make that known to say we're going to represent it, from the same raster data, we may scatter tree points and it'll still, it'll still be contained within the areas that are forested, but the individual placement of those trees might be different. So sometimes it's simply that, it's sort of communicating, working with a customer and explaining the differences. Other times we take those into account, and it may be that we have to simplify the way we're representing it. Ultimately, though, whatever we do, we try and get to a common representation of the 3D environment as much as possible, and then translate that out into the different engines so that you do maintain correlation as much as possible and kind of ensure the fair fight between those training simulators.
Now, you've got a product called Mantle ATM that goes a very long way to making things look the same, behave the same, and have a fair fight between all kinds of different systems that are integrated together. Earl, can you tell me a bit more about what Mantle ATM does, please, and the idea of a terrain pipeline?
Yeah, so sure. In a nutshell, I guess, Mantle ATM is our concept for a platform that lets us develop terrain pipelines. And it's built on, the history of TerraSim building TerraTools for the past, more than 2 decades at this point. So there's a lot of TerraTools technology built into it, and that the real shift there is going from an engineering level kind of desktop application to a mostly automated system. And so we can basically take all of the technology that's in TerraTools, we're combining it with that terrain engine we've talked about in VBS 4, so the procedural terrain pipeline, the VBS Blue data pipeline. And we make that then available to users where we configure it for them to suit their data sources that they're working with and their runtimes that they're exporting to. So what we might do some things like make those decisions about correlation and build them into the system. So as long as those continue to be relevant, then you have a fully automated pipeline. But we can also offer that engineering level control to go in and make changes to that automated process. So it's sort of a step up from the TerraTools concept of doing correlated terrain from one source to many outputs. We now have that more fully automated and can be installed at an enterprise scale so that all of your terrain data can be piped through this and automatically producing the runtime formats that you need.
Yeah, I was talking about speed of processing and so on. And I've seen and heard some very exciting statistics of how quickly an automated system could work once you tick off all the terrain data sources that you want to have, the area, the size. How long would it take to make a terrain 5 years ago, and how long could it take you to make an equivalent size terrain with Mantle ATM? And I know the answer is always it depends, but can you have a go?
Sure. So I guess if we think back 5 years ago to something like a 25 by 25 kilometer terrain with sort of video game level resolution, so 1 meter resolution imagery and 10 meter resolution elevation, just to give some context to the size of the problem, that would have taken 4 or 5 hours in the past, especially on hardware at the time. And I should also add that there's a lot of decision making in that. So there's someone sitting there having to kind of bring the pieces together and make decisions about each step and how to bring all of that terrain together to build it. As you said, it's hard to put it to a specific number now, but it's sort of sub hour at this point. And we're making some pretty big strides in terms of putting things into the cloud, at which point your wallet is kind of the limit for how quickly you want to have something built, because you now can take compute power from this sort of endless resource or almost endless resource. And the real challenge there is just that sometimes the data size is moving it around. So, to simplify it, it's at least tenfold and probably much more than that once you have it all configured well. That's
pretty amazing, actually. And I remember a particular customer of ours talking about taking months to build a terrain before, 9 months or so, or possibly a year. So that's really exciting. Let's look at not the latest today, but let's look at kind of slowly wrap up. I'll wrap up with 2 surprise questions. But we've looked at the state of play now, state of technology now. Bill, in 5 years' time, with things changing so quickly, what will have changed in making terrains?
Well, I think there'll probably be some new rendering system that we don't know about that'll be around. That just seems to be the trend, and so we'll obviously be ready to build terrains for that. But the biggest thing is probably on the data side. These kind of rendering systems, or I should say kind of AI generation from satellite imagery, and being able to produce accurate 3D environments for buildings, bridges, different structures that we see. So I think the data volume is going to increase massively, and also the quality of the data that's being produced. It's just going to keep getting refined, and that anytime we can leverage all the data that's out there and make better 3D environments, it just improves what we can do. And I think that's the thing that I'm really excited to see, is just how far we can push it with the source data that will be available.
Thanks, Bill. Oh, for you, what's going to change in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think it sort of builds on what Bill said. I think one of the areas that is obviously changing pretty quickly is the accessibility to the kind of retail consumer of things like drones that can fly with cameras around a site, and the software that you can then use to do photogrammetry to turn that into a 3D representation. That stuff is just becoming much, much more available to everyone. And I think we'll just continue to see that grow. And that's sort of another sort of crowdsourced data source that we can expect to see used in a lot of places. And yeah, I mean, the ability to, even from my phone, there's certain services now that act as a clearinghouse for the satellite data providers. You can actually task a satellite from your phone basically for effectively hundreds of dollars at this point with the way pricing works. So I think it's pretty incredible that you can do that and be able to get imagery from just a few days ago to the commercial market, right? Not obviously the specialists have been able to do that for a while, but all of that stuff is becoming much more available. So I think, yeah, on both ends, the kind of satellite imagery is going to just continue to get easier to get access to. And the sort of small scale user level sort of drone collections are just going to become more ubiquitous.
So your story about the American embassy in Baghdad was actually pretty pressing.
Yeah, right.
And as we wrap up, I'd like to ask you about some very particular terrains. What is the most interesting terrain you've ever worked on, Bill?
So I think the project that really sticks out to me is one that I did, I think about 10 years ago. So we built a terrain for all of Afghanistan using what was called the Consolidated Afghan Feature Data Set. So it was the coalition partners basically mapping each different country and the areas that they were operating in. They would map a 1 degree cell of data, brought it into this data set, and we were using that with the U.S. Army Geospatial Center to build a terrain for all of Afghanistan. So we used a lot of batch processing and created both for a JSAF application and an open flight. And so it was really interesting. It was a very, very fun collaborative project to work on with them. And that's the one that I'm definitely proud of what we did.
Cool.
Yeah, so mine is actually a terrain we built for the Dutch about 10 years ago, Marnehuizen, and it was quite a challenge to build it for VBS. It pushed a lot of technology forward. I'm glad to know that they're still using it today and they're looking to bring it into VBS 4. And it's interesting to see how a location can change over 10 years and the kinds of changes you have to make to keep the terrain relevant. So that's an interesting one.
That's great. And I can see Tess is hovering. So a one-word answer from both of you. What would make it more interesting terrain, San Jose or Pittsburgh or Bristol?
Oh,
San Jose.
I've built Bristol already, so I'll say Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Bill?
It's San Jose. Yeah, I like the Bay Area.
And I'll vote
Okay.
with the suspension bridge.
Yeah, I was going to say we got the suspension bridge for Bristol. It's got to count for something. So Bristol wins 2-1. Right. Thank you so much. I've actually got other questions for Train, but we have run out of time. We have got, you mentioned Lux, Carter, and Maxar. They're both here at the show all week. So if you want to talk terrain, actual delivery as well, you can do that. We have got one question in the chat, which I do want to raise because all of this is really important. We do need skills in this space. And I don't think people realize sometimes how many different kinds of skills we need to build simulation, and one of these key ones is terrain. We have Johanna Oliver has asked, in terms of 3D, if someone wants to join you, what would be the best thing to show in their portfolio? So looking for a job, basically, guys. Have you got a job?
Yeah.
And what do they need to do to put in the portfolio?
Yeah, so I think we always look for a combination of skills. Obviously, anything focused on 3D modeling, GIS is useful for sort of the terrain developer role. I think things to really set yourself apart, sort of showing, personal projects where you've kind of gone beyond, is always useful. And showing an interest in what we do. So that it's always amazing to me the number of applications we get where people seem like they want a job, but they don't even research the industry. And if you're trying to break into a new area, spend some time trying to learn about it, know what to talk about, and really show you're really interested in moving into this arena.
Well, and actually, they've got a head start. They've shown interest, haven't they? If they're in the platform here, fully immersed at DSET, you've got a head start. Get in contact with Bohemia and find out more. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you.
I have open positions, so yeah, we are always looking
Come
for
on,
good people.
we have an invitation. And in fact, we have a lot of postgraduate students here this week at our invitation to actually matchmake with the companies here this week. So we're looking for a record on that this year as well. So very exciting. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Rusmat, we'll see you in person later and tomorrow. Earl and Bill, hope to see you online at some point as well this week.